Thank you, Elaine, for having me. The bill's a significant but mainly symbolic step in getting the government to recognize hate crimes against Asians in America. It won't do much to change things on the ground, but it might help us get a handle on the scope of the current problem. It expedites review, it creates online or helps create online collection of data and so forth. But it's only the first step in bringing the problem of hate crimes against Asians to the attention of the government, and apparently only insofar as they're related to the current COVID-19 crisis. I hope that the recognition of this problem opens the door for discussion of the very long and continuing history of violence against Asians in American history, not just hate crimes related to the pandemic.
Well, Professor, that brings me to my next question. We know that President Biden has been doing other things to counter these attacks, a new task force, more funding. But one part in this bill, and I want to quote it for you, it says, issues guidance on mitigating the use of racially discriminatory language to describe the pandemic. So let's go outside the pandemic. Can the average person distinguish between that kind of language and other terms that are being used on a political and diplomatic level?
Well, there is a long history of kind of using this racial terms to describe disease and with the use of kind of Asian stereotypes, right? There is a fairly constant barrage in the press that blames China for this pandemic and so forth. So regardless of the kind of very gross use of terms like kung fu and so forth, there's a fairly constant drumbeat, I think, against China in this regard. And it seems to me that we need to understand the continuous pattern of racial violence against Asian people. It's not limited to any one ethnic group or region of the United States. You can be Korean in Atlanta, Chinese in New York, Filipino in San Francisco, or Sikh in Indianapolis, and still be attacked and killed by a racist who thinks you don't belong here because of the way you look or speak, because they think you're some other kind of Asian they hate. So I think we need to look much more broadly at this problem.
So, that's a great point. And as you mentioned, by Washington standards, this legislation has moved pretty fast. The president is expected to sign it. But this brings us to your point. What does this do on the ground? What more needs to be done when it comes to policing Asian hate crimes, when it comes to charging people with hate crimes and the penalties and the sentences that go along with all of that?
Well, I think one of the problems is that many people, I think myself included, don't think that simply more police on the streets, more policing, more long sentences and incarceration really gets to the root of the problem. I would argue that the long history of violence against Asians in the United States actually begins in Asia and the Pacific. The United States has been at war in the Pacific and in Asia continuously for 200 years. And we can't understand the Atlanta massacre unless we understand the My Lai massacre in Vietnam and the cultures of sexual exploitation and violence that surround U.S. military bases in Korea, the Philippines, Okinawa, really throughout the Pacific and Asia. So it's a larger, much more systemic problem that we need to dismantle.